welcome back. Few people joining us still, so we'll wait for a sec. Mm-hmm. All right, let us begin. The session we have planned today is to address one of the critical questions that emerged from our investigation and other people's inquiries into the public attitudes about global warming, which is why is it that there seems to be this persistent disconnect between concern about global warming, which has been rising over the last decade, and different policies, willingness to do things about the problem, perhaps disconnect between the energy sector and understanding of energy and global warming, perhaps it's a kind of thinness or weakness to real concern about global warming. How do we build up that concern? How do we draw those connections out? What could be done to engage with the public in a constructive way? And we have a really fabulous panel to discuss these questions and to answer your questions as well. Ed Maybach is the professor at George Mason University and the head of the George Mason Center for Climate Change Communication. Marianne Hitt is director of the Beyond Coal Project at the Sierra Club. Eric Holdsworth is the director of the Climate Change Program at the Edison Electric Institute. And Barry Rabe is my colleague at the University of Michigan and frequent traveler in various circles, but someone who works very close to the same work that David and I have been working on. So let us start off, and we'll just go straight down and get your reactions to this question of what is the nature of the disconnect, and how do we draw that connection out?
Thanks, Steve. So Ed Maybach, George Mason University, with my colleague Tony Leiserowitz at Yale and Connie Rosa Renouf, we've been conducting similar sort of survey research. Since 2008, we've been surveying a cross-section of the American public every 6 months. And the good news is we're finding largely the same things. So we see, really strong support for clean renewable energy, a real strong sense, particularly among Democrats and independents, that we should be pivoting away from fossil fuels. The same among Republicans, but a little bit less strongly. In many ways, sort of the strong level of support for renewable energy is really more or less unprecedented in current times, because we as Americans agree on very few things. So the fact that we see such strong agreement on clean energy is really quite remarkable. I would say so while our findings are the same, my personal interpretation of them might be a little bit differently. The interpretation of where is the disconnect. Namely, I don't believe there's a disconnect between the issue of climate change and people's energy preferences, as I've said, we see very strong support for renewable energy. The disconnect is between public preference and what our elected officials are actually doing. So while I know leaders on both sides of the aisle are looking at these polling findings, I hear from them and members of their staff that they don't necessarily believe them. They don't dispute that this is the public's preference. They just believe that the preference is latent and not manifest. So while the public and voters may well have these preferences, our elected officials don't seem to believe currently that they're willing to actually back it up with essentially consequences if public officials don't move forward to move towards these stated preferences. So I guess that's it. That's really, that's where I see the disconnect. And you know, I suppose the upcoming election is going to be a real interesting test of that question. Our most recent survey shows a really substantial portion of the public who is willing to take action politically to enforce, to encourage our elected officials to move forward with these stated preferences. Whether, I don't necessarily see it in the public dialogue around the elections right now. So I guess the outcomes in the next few weeks will be very telling.
Okay. Marianne?
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And if I could just start and offer up my experience as director of the Beyond Coal campaign as kind of my window into this really important question. The Beyond Coal campaign started in 2002 when people around the country were seeing proposals for new coal plants popping up in their backyards. And being the Sierra Club, we have members everywhere. We have partner organizations everywhere. And this was pushed in part by Vice President Cheney's Energy Task Force. And when they were all tallied up, there were over 200 new coal plants that were proposed to be built all around this country. And so with initially very few resources, not necessarily a lot of expertise, local people started trying to block these projects because they were worried about air pollution impacts, water pollution impacts. There was some concern around climate change, but more around the pollution and also the implications for local economic development and property values of having a big new industrial polluter. And 12 years later, we collectively have stopped 183 new coal plants from being built all across this country. There was only a small handful that were built. Arguably the biggest climate achievement in this country in the past decade, but it was really driven by people's concern about their backyards and public health and their communities. And so that network of people has now shifted focus to the existing coal plants, over 500 of them, which, since they're not going to be replaced by new coal plants, they are facing these investment decisions about putting on retrofits to meet modern health and safety standards, or instead retiring, phasing out the plants, and investing in other forms of energy. And we have, to date, 1 out of every 3 coal plants in this country has been announced for retirements just since 2010. This is a huge sea change in how we make energy in this country. And I would argue, yes, low gas prices are a factor. Yes, the changing economics around energy are a factor. But having seen these campaigns up close and personal, it's also driven very much. I was just in Chicago a couple of days ago, and I was with Kim Wasserman, who won the prize called the Nobel Prize for the Environment. She was one of the people who helped retire coal plants in the city of Chicago that were so old, Thomas Edison had signed the guest book of them, and they were still operating in 2012. And she was motivated because her child had asthma. She lived right next to this coal plant, and no one in her community actually knew what it was. And when they figured out what it was, they got involved, and they had this very intensive 10-year campaign that ultimately resulted in those coal plants retiring. And so people I have seen are accomplishing some pretty outstanding kind of David and Goliath campaign victories, motivated by their, fighting for their families, fighting for their communities. And it is adding up to change on the scale that matters when it comes to climate change. We've got, our lowest emissions in 2 decades here in this country as a result of our reduced use of coal. 179 coal plants, 1 out of every 3 coal plants announced for retirement. And as Administrator McCarthy mentioned, we have these these pollution loopholes that the coal industry has enjoyed, as no other industry has. Mercury was mentioned. That one is finally, federal standards in place, but there are others that are out there. We have no federal standards for how coal ash is disposed of, no meaningful federal limits on toxic water pollution from coal plants, no limits on carbon pollution from coal plants. And so there's real public hunger to, I think, close some of those loopholes motivated by people's concern for public health and the environment. And I think it's a real success story driven by, again, regular people fighting for their communities and their families in their own backyards, and adding up to change that's really making a difference on a scale that matters. And in terms of where is the disconnect into climate, I think a lot of people that I've met who get involved in these campaigns, that's the first time they've really thought about energy and where their energy comes from. And that advocacy gets them in their communities thinking about how other people might be affected by energy choices, and they get thinking about climate change for the first time. And so So up until that point, I think it had just been a kind of a remote concern. And when people are, it's an entry point, whether you're concerned about mining or whether your water is safe to drink or your air is healthy to breathe. You then start learning more and connecting the dots, and a lot of these folks become lifelong, climate advocates and clean energy advocates. So.
Eric.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I think interesting the questions posed as a disconnect, and I think maybe we see it as a bit more of indirect action. Obviously, electricity is everywhere in our society. The production of energy and electricity is crucial to our economy, to our state of being. I see all the iPhones and Apples and laptops and all of that, of course, powered by electricity, the lights in the room. So, of course, electricity plays a critical role in our society, and also the benefits of electrification are well known as you're able to electrify societies. There are all kinds of concomitant health benefits and societal benefits. So electricity plays a critical role in our society. Of course, as Gina noted, in this country, we're a large source of CO2 emissions. And we're a customer-driven organization, a customer-driven industry. And I think as the polling has pointed out, Americans do, we hear this all the time. We've been hearing it for probably 2 decades, that people want their energy cleaner and they want it cheaper. And as a customer-driven industry, we've been trying to respond to that and are doing a lot to help drive this sort of revolution. Gina mentioned this sort of transformation that's going on in the industry, and it's true. It's been going on now for quite a while as we transition away from coal plants and into more gas plants and other cleaner forms of energy. It's been the industry that's been trying to help lead the way, driven by a variety of factors, regulations, fuel prices, et cetera, but trying to sort of step up and lead that challenge. We've been doing a lot, and I think this to me, right, our customers are the public. So there's a connection. And people do want it cleaner. So what have you been doing? Well, we're leaders in helping to deploy new wind energy and new solar, whether that's rooftop solar or it's large-scale concentrated solar, trying to drive more energy efficiency, a whole wide variety of technologies, deploying more gas plants, which are lower emitting than coal. Interestingly, I mean, even a few members, putting up a lot of their own money to help develop state-of-the-art, first-of-a-kind coal plant that would capture upwards of 70 to 80% initially of its carbon and ultimately maybe wrapped it up to 90%. Now, what role coal will play in our energy mix down the road is to be determined, but it's pretty clear globally that there's going to be a lot of coal use, and so I think this is one of those efforts that helps in a global sense people be able to address the issue, bringing that technology, and of course the first of a kind are always the most expensive, but as we've been able to develop these other technologies, look at wind and solar and other forms of energy whose costs have come down, as the administrator noted, that's driven by being able to get out there and deploy, right? Develop, deploy, improve, and our industry is sort of uniquely positioned to be able to do that. So we've been able to do that, responding to things like renewable portfolio standards. Customers get flyers in their bill, right, where they can agree to pay a certain amount each month to help support renewable energy. So there's a way that our industry is sort of connecting with customers and helping drive the clean energy revolution. And ultimately, it's going to be those cleaner technologies, the lower and non-emitting technologies that are going to help us from an electricity production and power sector standpoint be able to address the issue of climate change. So there's a lot going on, and I see this then as sort of an indirect action. Customers, the public, support these technologies. They get into the flyers. And I think what's really interesting is the sort of recent developments on smart meters and what people can do at home. And that's really an exciting revolution there because, again, trying to get smart meters out there and develop apps so people can use their phone to control their energy use and make using your electricity something that the customer engages in and gets an active interest in. Oh, how do I minimize my energy use, and how do I sort of maximize my time of my pricing and do this the right way? How can I, as an individual, maybe I want to support, lower energy development those things might ramp up and down on the grid at certain times. Getting the customer really involved has become an exciting new development in the industry. And so I think in all of those ways, we're seeing somewhat indirect connections for people saying, hey, I can, the less energy that you produce, the less energy that's needed, that's fewer power plants or fewer baseload systems that need to be built, which again has sort of long-term climate benefits. So there's a lot going on. I think there are some indirect connections going on there, although people do have that sort of public disconnect.
Barry?
Thank you, Steve. Let me begin by noting my deep respect and gratitude to you and Dave for doing this work. We have needed this book for a long time, and the timing is just extraordinary as the climate and energy debates move forward in the United States and around the world. In fact, the book is so good, I want to do a short dramatic reading for you from it. Pay more, get nothing. Now, imagine if one of our survey teams, Ed and Tony's, Steve and David, myself with Christopher Bork at Muhlenberg College, were to call you tonight and ask you, how do you feel? How have you benefited from the fact that American greenhouse gas emissions are down 10% from 2004? One, would you even know that? Secondly, what would you say are the tangible benefits that you and your family have derived from that? We tend not to think about that or talk about that very much, and there might be enormous elements of imprecision in how we could even begin to answer that. How has the climate changed because of this unilateral action? Not because of one federal policy, but a mixture of factors. And would be able to identify anything. And so one of the things that I really like about the book is it talks about ways you might be able to change that calculus. And one key aspect of that is linking it with local environmental harms. Exactly the point that we're now hearing from the EPA administrator that we really did not hear very much of during the Waxman-Markey conversations 5 years ago. And I think that goes a long way to explaining, one, why so many states have been acting much more aggressively on this question, because they can think about some of the local clustering and activities that might emerge. And it may offer some really interesting paths for federal policy or international policy. But with it, for me, is the question of, because the cost and a price, whether it's a carbon tax or an auctioning mechanism for cap and trade, is so visible and so salient and does indeed get thumbs down whenever any of us have raised that question, are there ways to close that gap, possibly by demonstrating or conferring a benefit? There's a very nice section that neither of you had time, given the fact that you were covering a lot of ground in about 15 minutes, to talk about, and that is how folks' views of a carbon tax changes when you begin to specify the revenue. We've done similar experiments, Chris Borick and I. And when you raise the deficit reduction question, it doesn't really move the needle very much. In fact, we find that Democrats are less likely to support a carbon tax if the money goes to deficit reduction as opposed to an unnamed source. If you talk about revenue neutrality or commensurate tax reductions, that really does move the needle. And the book is really great with that. One thing we've begun to experiment with that we've really found quite intriguing is if you talk about imposing the price and then tying that to energy efficiency and or renewable energy or alternative energy R&D, and we've tried this 3 different times, the needle moves. Clear majority of Democrats support, even a near majority of Republicans support, which we've never seen on a carbon pricing question asked any other way. Now, it's not clear exactly how all this works and how public opinion translates into policy, as we all struggle with it in this arena. But I would argue from a policy perspective, if you're looking over the last 5 to 7 years, where carbon pricing has been tried around the world, whether you're upfront about it and call it a tax or call it something else, those policies that have been adopted, have endured, have made it through an election cycle, have been really, really clear about what the benefit is. And so people have a capacity to know that, along with the potential local co-benefits. So I think this aspect of framing provides some real opportunities and interesting questions, certainly as we think about the future of survey design, but also the link between policy. And I think also, as Administrator McCarthy noted this morning, there are conversations all over the country on how to deal with this Clean Power Plan mandate. What do states do with this opportunity? And the opportunity to reopen all of these conversations and look at these pieces state to state, region to region, making for a very interesting time with a policy that I don't think anyone of us could have anticipated 5 years ago would be the way in which the U.S. would begin to deal with this issue, at least in the power sector going forward. Thanks.
All right. I have some directed questions at each of you. I'd like to actually start with Mary Ann, because I think the story, it started at the local level, because the story is quite a compelling one. And you know, we often come at it from a really high level, and you're coming at it at a very local and immediate level. And it's taken a long time to scale up and so forth. But if you think about the scale of the activity, how scalable is it? Like, how many conversations have to happen, especially as sort of coal goes away and move to the next set of debates? Is it power plant by power plant, or can you imagine something that's maybe still a local conversation, but maybe more engaged? And what would that be about? What would the issue be about?
Well, I think of this whole campaign as an open source network. It's over 100 organizations. Some of these individual coal plant retirement campaigns, like the one in Chicago, are very big and robust. We just won a campaign in Indianapolis where we had over 50 organizations just in Indianapolis that were part of it, same scale of collaboration in Chicago. And it doesn't end when that coal plant decides to retire. There are questions about what happens to that coal plant site, and there are questions about what do you replace the coal power with. And so I think it's scalable in a couple of ways. One is these decisions about how, if we're going to stop using one source of energy, what are we going to replace it with? They're all being made at the same time in public utility commissions, in state regulatory agencies. And so kind of power plant by power plant and state by state, we're not just figuring out what are we going to do about this polluting power plant, but we're figuring out what's the path forward. And we have seen time and again that when these conversations happen, a lot of times we're bringing in information about the affordability of wind and solar, and the utilities end up making much bigger investments in wind and solar than they were initially planning to, because they're so much cheaper than they had anticipated. They're just, Georgia and Texas recently have done big RFPs for solar that came in at 5 cents and 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is just remarkable. I mean, that's competitive with coal. In Utah and Colorado, they have had bids for solar coming in cheaper than natural gas. And so things are changing really quickly, and these are openings when we can put that information forward. There are going to be a lot more of those happening over the next 3, 4, 5 years. There's, 1 out of every 3 coal plants is announced for retirement, but the other 2/3 aren't getting any younger. And then the other place is the Clean Power Plan. The other place where we can scale this up is every state is now mandated to have a conversation about what's our energy portfolio, how do we reduce the carbon emissions. And I think, if we fighting new coal plants 10 years ago would have had a crystal ball, and we would have said, okay, in 10 years we're going to have a federal climate policy that's really 50 states charting their energy future in their public utility commissions and their state regulatory agencies. What should we build? We should build this big open source network of advocates and experts and attorneys who've spent the last decade and a half honing their expertise on energy policy and who are the decision makers in the state. And they're now, this same network of folks are ready to engage in all these state conversations. And so it really is an unprecedented opportunity, I think, to scale this up and move beyond just talking about the fate of particular power plants and chart the energy future for all of our states and then collectively for the country. It's really exciting.
Moving over to Eric, I had a couple questions actually. First, some very detailed questions. What's been the uptake of the smart meters and these other programs? I know that the CUSP program at NYU is really pushing for like monitoring of all of New York City, which is like this fantastic program that Steve Koonen's launched. But what, in terms of just the day-to-day electric utilities pushing out these kind of information campaigns and smart meters and so forth, what's been the uptake, and do we have any measurable effect yet from the consumer perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the latest statistics I have seen, and we have something like 50 million smart meters have been deployed across the country, which is almost half of the country, which is fairly rapid for a relatively new technology. And a lot of our members have been running local campaigns to then make people aware of what these meters can help them do, how they can better manage their electricity, developing the sort of the follow-on apps and web applications that people can use. So it's definitely having an impact. I mean, I think we've seen that in EIA statistics. The energy demand growth has slowed significantly. I mean, EIA used to forecast annual energy demand growth of like 2% a year. I think the latest AEO, Annual Energy Outlook publication, has it at less than 0.5%. I mean, if you told our industry that 10 years ago, I think they would have been like, what? I think you could check your numbers. Maybe that's 5%, not 0.5%. So, I mean, a significant impact, and obviously more to go. Part of it is, customer acceptance, getting people to engage. It's not, the smart meter is good, but, you need to have the customer engaged. To me, that's kind of part of this, getting the public engaged in wanting to use their energy more efficiently. Well, that has obvious climate benefits, so.
So I don't want to put you two on the spot, but could you guys imagine collaborating together and doing something where like the consumer side and the activist side were like somehow really plugged into each other, create a synergy that really pushed out smart meters, other information campaigns, and really got people.
Well, and I won't speak for Mary Ann, but I do know that our organization worked with a sister environmental organization, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and we issued a joint statement, sort of more around rooftop solar and distributed generation, but the two groups coming together to make the common point about, promoting this technology while recognizing the overall value of the grid to everybody and making sure that when you do this, when you move these technologies forward, let's make sure we do it in a way that, helps keep the system running, that is fair and equitable to everybody. And we, that was one example, but I find, and I think Mary Ann kind of hinted at this when even at the local level, when you're talking to the PUCs and people are negotiating settlements on coal plants, right? All those stakeholders are coming together, right? Our members are sitting down with Mary and her people and everybody, on the PUCs to find what's the best solution for the state, for the customers, for the individuals that are going to meet those sort of environmental goals. So there's a fair amount of collaboration, though of course that is never a great media story. It's always better to play up, the other side of it. And no doubt we obviously have probably very differing views perhaps on exact policy solutions. But I think it's important for all of us on the climate space to be looking for that common ground. There is just enough divisiveness that, really slows the ability to kind of get into this from the kind of policy level that's needed to really engage in the dramatic changes. So where we find those synergies, that's a good thing, I think, if we can do that.
And then I had a question for Ed and Barry together, which goes to Ed's point, which is where Ed sees the disconnect is between the public and political leadership. And what are some pathways that you see to foster that? Like, what's needed, what's missing?
Ultimately, political leaders are correct. If public opinion is one thing, but the public isn't willing to actually enforce that with any sort of penalty, unless our leaders do our bidding, it's all fairly meaningless. As I said, in our most recent survey, we ask a fairly pointed set of questions. If a friend, or if somebody you trusted and liked asked you to do the following things, how likely would you be to do so? And the things were sort of a whole range of political actions, including voting for a candidate and donating to a candidate's campaign, et cetera. Certainly, there was a huge, not a majority, but a strong minority of people who said they would do take a variety of different actions in support of climate policy. Conversely, we also ask, what have you actually done over the past 12 months? And there was a huge gap between those two, which is why I say, this demand is more latent than manifest. So I would suggest that organizations like Mary Ann's, which are actually playing that role of being the trusted individual or organization, asking people to take specific actions, is one way to bridge that divide. Sort of more generally in the literature on philanthropy, the #1 survey after survey shows that the #1 reason why people don't give to charitable organizations is they say, nobody asked me to. And so I think that same thing is going on here, that the segment of the public who is willing to take action is much larger than the segment of public who feels that they have been asked to take specific actions.
I'd like to go back to the Clean Power Plan. For as long as there's been a Clean Air Act, many states have argued they would like more flexibility and latitude to tailor strategies that work for their economy. And whatever the flaws of the Clean Power Plan, they've just been given that opportunity. Now there will be quibbles about carbon budgets, as Administrator McCarthy noted. I think there's an anticipation of a long, long, protracted struggle in implementing all of this. We're already seeing almost a third of the states look at ways to erect barriers to any kind of response and compliance. That said, it does kind of take us back almost to 2006, 2007, the California period, which was really the high watermark of creativity and policy design. And we're in a very different position now than we were in the middle of the last decade. We actually have empirical experience with what does and does not work. If you promise a portfolio standard and say there's going to be X green jobs and Y this or that, we can measure that across 30 states and look at best practice. Some of these policies have been really effective. Some of these have not. And if states want to enter into that conversation, it does create a very, very interesting forum, or even working across state borders and state boundaries, joining in with an existing plan and the like. So it does decentralize the conversation, and then I think does create some real challenges and opportunities for political leaders, the new era of governors, the new era of agency heads, for which we had almost complete turnover since the period in the mid-2000s where this was going forward, and seeing if that can be jump-started. I think across the board, for industry, for advocacy groups, this asks, can you play a constructive role in the conversation and really begin to build a consensus as opposed to divide, and I think the jury's out on that, but there is an opportunity.
Great. Let's take some questions. There's a roving, is there a standing mic right there? So if you can just go to the standing mic, and there's one here and one here. And we'll tell me your name and where you're from, and go ahead and ask your question. You can direct it to the panel as a whole or to someone in particular.
Absolutely. Am I really the only person here who wants to ask a question? That's surprising.
No.
Oh, perfect. Sorry, judged you early. Well, first of all, thank you all so very much for coming to this university, Georgetown University, and speaking here on this panel. It's an absolutely wonderful opportunity to have a variety of experts come here and discuss a series of important issues and their various expertises on those issues. My name is Aaron Silverman. I'm a freshman in the SFS, and I'm a member of an organization called GU Green here on, GU Fossil Free, excuse me, here on Georgetown's campus. And GU Fossil Free is a divestment campaign that aims to connect and manifest students' favorable opinions to divest from fossil fuel companies with the university administration's investment policies. And one really interesting point that you were making earlier was regarding manifest versus latent tendencies, and manifest versus latent actions that can sort of be used to help bridge what exists as public opinion and what exists as public action, something concrete. And so this question is primarily directed to Mrs. Hitt. With your experiences bridging American public opinion with substantive policy, how do you feel not only about the importance of Georgetown's own divestment campaign, but also divestment campaigns all across the country, including but not limited to Stanford's?
Well, thank you for raising that. And for those who may not be tracking it as closely, there's been a wave of campus divestment from fossil fuel campaigns that have, I would maybe the last 2-3 years, have really kind of swept the nation. And it's been an incredible new infusion of creativity and energy into the climate movement. And I think there are a couple of reasons that it's really important. I was on a panel in New York during the week of the climate march at NYU, and there were several people from the financial sector talking about how the outlook for the coal industry is not good, and because of lots of competition from other forms of energy, because of the advocacy that we're doing, because of the sort of regulatory outlook, and a lot of investors are quietly getting rid of their coal stock. And this is kind of something that's known in the financial sector among those on Wall Street. But when Stanford divests from coal, and there's an article about that in the New York Times, that has cultural significance, and I think it resonates in a way that these very quiet changes happening in the financial markets may never sink into not just your average person, but the sort of the intellectual set in this country, the thought leaders. Seeing Stanford divest from coal sends a much, much bigger signal than anything quietly happening in the back rooms of Wall Street could, kind of culturally and politically. And for those who don't know, there was a big divestment campaign there, and they announced a few months ago that their first step is divesting from coal, and then they're taking a look at their whole endowment. And so I think it's important because it's sort of culturally, politically very significant. And I also think it's important because it's giving an opportunity of a generation of young people who I think are the last ones who have the chance to turn the corner on climate change. I have a 4-year-old, and by the time she is an adult, this window of opportunity we have to do something about climate change is going to largely have closed. And so today's generation of college students are really the last generation of people, along with all of us sitting here on the stage, who have this responsibility and this opportunity to do something about climate change, and it's a venue for that action to happen in as many places as folks want it to happen. So it's a super important engagement opportunity, and I think it's sending very important kind of political and social signals as well.
Thank you very much.
As well as financial.
Thank you again.
Hey, Aaron Hurtis. I do communications work with Union of Concerned Scientists. I'm curious, this is a question for the panel. When it comes to adaptation to climate change and resilience to the effects of climate change, we've noticed in some communities, particularly Virginia, Maryland, Florida, that is changing the conversation in some different ways and makes the climate issue feel more immediate because a lot of those communities are at the bleeding edge of dealing with sea level rise. So I'm wondering how that plays into your thinking around climate communication and policy. And specifically, I was curious where the utility industry is at and its thinking about climate adaptation, how drought and heat waves affect electricity loads, and the degree to which coastal facilities are vulnerable to rising seas, for instance. Thanks.
I'll be happy to start if that's fine. Yeah, no, in fact, that's an issue that is really on our radar screen. It has come around. We have a bunch of members that are taking a lot of very forward-looking actions on climate adaptation. In fact, in Florida, two of our utilities, NextEra and Tampa Electric, have done a lot to sort of harden their own grid, to take actions to be able to address those issues. I mean, they regularly see, flooding issues for a variety of reasons. Obviously, a fair number of hurricanes come through that area. So they live and breathe that kind of responding to those weather events all the time. They've gone and done it. Our utilities in New York are really leading a kind of a pioneering effort. Con Ed, after Superstorm Sandy, has really gone in and doing an incredible amount to sort of not just harden their grid, but in some ways create microgrids in a whole different way, maybe in some ways, of being able to keep the electricity running and be able to adapt to and prepare for those changes. Because obviously, yeah, you have to factor in that type of activity and those are just some of the examples. We've got folks elsewhere doing. So it's on the radar screen. People are looking at it. I mean, in some ways, it's a bit abstract. You kind of react in some ways to the situation at hand. Like a polar vortex. I mean, you've got to be able to respond and just get the fuels and produce the power. But through the sort of smart metering program, through the growth in distributed generation, again, we're seeing those are developing some tools and technologies to help the industry better adapt and prepare for all kinds of weather impacts.
Could I add to that briefly? Mm-hmm. Great question, Aaron. So the human condition, the human mind is really good with dealing with concrete information. We're not so good with dealing with abstractions. Global climate change is the ultimate of all abstractions. Conversely, local impacts and local benefits are very concrete. So one of the most promising ways forward to engage people in thinking about the larger picture is to engage them in thinking about their own backyard, sort of to the young gentleman's point here. Ultimately, thinking about what can we do to protect ourselves against local impacts, the adaptation question, is an incredibly helpful way of engaging them, thinking about it in a thinking about the problem in a very concrete manner, which the evidence is really clear. We're just much better at dealing with concrete realities rather than abstract situations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think we're just at the beginning of an exploration, including some of the very states that you correctly mentioned, of what adaptation means, how it gets translated into public policy, and especially when we think, just say, of the coastal question, how much of the responsibility for that is borne by individual property owners who have taken risk, and how much for levels of government, local, state, or federal. And if there is going to be a governmental policy response, how is that set up? And then ultimately, where does the money come from to fund those strategies? I think especially Florida right now becomes an intriguing test bed for that as you're beginning to see statewide, county by county, some of those discussions and conversations. And so it's also an additional way to frame the local environmental harm issue and then possibly local environmental harm remediation beyond reduction of conventional emissions. So I think we're just at the beginning of thinking through what that might entail.
Good morning. My name is Seth Heald. I'm a volunteer with the Sierra Club in Virginia. In Virginia, pretty much everyone gets their electric power either from Dominion Resources, AEP, or one of the electric co-ops. The electric co-ops all belong to the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And so those two companies and the Rural Electric Co-op Association are all members of the American Legislative Exchange Council. Which has been in the press a lot lately. A lot of big companies have left it over its climate science denial. And just this summer at the ALEC conference, the Heartland Institute, known infamously for climate science denial, put on a presentation, and ALEC brings together state legislators who come and hear this stuff. So my question for Mr. Holdsworth is, how do we, and this kind of relates to Professor Maybach's note about the disconnect between what people out in the country think and what leaders are doing. How do we get beyond this? How do we get the electric utility industry to stop doing this sort of thing?
I think, you know, in looking at the, first of all, our industry obviously works with everybody out there in trying to advance public policy and addressing issues like climate change. So we work with a wide variety of stakeholders, a lot of times, you know, in an educational mode. And I think the industry is doing a lot. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily hang belonging to any one group on action or inaction. I think the actions that our members are taking demonstrate that they're addressing the issue and trying to develop clean energy. Dominion has been a real leader in shifting from some of their coal to gas assets and developing first-of-a-kind biomass plant, working on increasing wind energy. So individual actions, I think, speak loudly. And you know, I can't comment on the activity of ALEC. I don't know what, you know, all the stuff that they do. They're just one of many groups that, you know, we reach out to as a way of trying to educate stakeholders on our industry's views on issues. And I think, as I've tried to demonstrate here, trying to really move that dialogue forward and reach out, you know, and respond to the demands of the public and policymakers.
And I would just add that that's part of the role. Our role as advocates to my fellow Sierra Clubber there is the companies aren't where we feel like they need to be, and we have to keep pushing on the ground in the states where they're doing their business and changing the equation about dirty energy versus clean energy. So,
thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Scott Moore. I'm with the Council on Foreign Relations here in D.C. Among the many very interesting things that to me have come out of this presentation so far is kind of the idea or the proposition that this intense localization of how the public views the climate change issue could go some way to explaining why we see such aggressive action at the subnational level as opposed to kind of higher levels of political organization. And to me, that's particularly significant because that's not just an American phenomenon, it's virtually a global phenomenon. So the question, which I'd like to kind of pose to the whole panel, is whether you have some thoughts, you know, whether from your research or just more generally your experience about how best to sort of try to link these kind of movements or this ambition at the subnational level and to try to make that something greater than the sum of its individual parts. Thank you.
Well, that is what we are trying to do in the Beyond Coal campaign, essentially, is take these local backyard coal plant campaigns and knit them together into something that's making a difference on the scale of the climate problem and where people realize, I mean, I came into this because I grew up in Appalachia. My daughter's an 11th generation West Virginian through my husband's side of the family. And so I came to this because I was upset about mountains being blown up in Appalachia for coal. And then there were a couple of coal plants proposed. We tried to stop those because we thought that would result in more mountains being blown up. We met other people around the country who were, you know, worried about asthma, worried about water pollution, worried about climate change. And so I do think that that can be at least the role of the NGO and the advocacy sectors, which is what I can speak for, is to take these individual pieces and knit them together and then provide people with kind of the infrastructure and the resources they need to keep going. Because once they win one of these campaigns or have one of these successes, that is a big motivator to do more. So that's one piece of it.
Actually, I think that part of what's happening in the discourse, if you go back to 2009, as Barry suggested, was it's shifted from being a national or global discourse to this has to work from the ground up. And it has to fit into the existing regulatory infrastructure and framework that's set down in EPA and other organizations. And that people pushed really hard for national policy in 2009, and they just weren't able to move forward. But then they discovered that there were all these other cool things happening through organizations like the Sierra Club, through the electric utilities, through academic research institutes, and so forth, that were actually making a whole lot more progress than a national discourse. So I think it is an integrated, we're at this integrative moment of trying to bring all this together. There's just been a lot of not fragmented localism, but a lot of localism pushing in different directions, and it is, I think, starting to gel. I mentioned it once before, but I think the most intriguing project in this regard is the CUSP project at NYU, and there are a few other city-based projects. We've been focusing on states, but I think it's really at the city level. 80% of people in the world live in cities, right? So it's really at the city level that this issue has to be dealt with. Toronto has a project, London has a project, Tokyo has a project, and New York has a project, and boy, those are the big ones, so start there. And I think that those are things worth looking very closely at to see how things are getting knitted together.
This is a huge policy challenge, and this question of stitching together collaboration across subfederal or even national boundaries, putting it into a continental perspective, has been a real disappointment. 5 years ago, there were 23 states and 4 provinces committed to one of 3 regional cap-and-trade zones. We're now down to 10 states and 1 province, and the only cross-border nationally arrangement involves Quebec and California, separated by 2,500 miles. If you look at portfolio standards, 30 states, they've held together, and yet in many cases, those are constructed almost like arms control treaties, with so many provisions to maximize the generation of within-state energy, to prevent movement cross-border. We've not seen the kind of collaboration there in a number of these other policies, whether they're hard or soft, that we might have hoped to. Hopefully that begins to shift going forward. And since you mentioned the kind of international aspect, given the huge changes we're seeing in Mexico in terms of governance of all aspects of energy, including the possibility of expanded natural gas drilling, similar issues in Canada, the continental aspects of this are really, really intriguing, and yet we see relatively little conversation, aside from the easy stuff, where the governor of California goes to a neighboring state in Mexico and has a photo op. Actually moving that into policy has been a lot tougher than a lot of folks were thinking 5 or 10 years ago.
Yes, I'm Bill Gormley from the McCourt School. Welcome. My question is for Barry Ray. Over the past 10 years, you've written eloquently about the role of the states in the United States as pioneers in promoting climate change. And as you reflect on these state experiences, what has the role of public opinion been? Has it been significant? Has the impact of public opinion on the state's climate change policies been indirect, working through interest groups, or more direct? And more broadly, looking to the future, do you see the public opinion as a sort of sleeping giant that can and will ultimately turn this conversation around? Or is it one of many political forces that is likely to have a more subtle impact?
Appreciate the question, Bill. I think, looking back, a concern that I have now that I did not see at the time was the relatively fragile body of support for a great many of these initiatives, including limited engagement or even awareness of the public. In many, many states, small and large, there was kind of an internal conversation, often led by leaders of state government agencies, often finding a supportive governor, and putting something together. But whether that could be durable and last through a change of government, change of leadership, and for there to really be public understanding and buy-in has been pretty uneven. In fact, that may go back to my response to the previous question, why so many of these cap-and-trade agreements collapsed very, very hurriedly, accelerated by the decisions in Washington. So that's a challenge, and I think going forward, the issue of getting a broader body of buy-in, whatever that entails, is very, very significant to make sure that whatever the next round of climate policy may be, state level, regional, or otherwise, there's a chance that there can be more resiliency or durability. This does then go to the core aspects of this book, that where is the public and where is that sweet spot of informing and engaging the public when it's pretty clear that just something focused on climate change and just focused on the greenhouse gas emissions, independent of other considerations, is probably not going to move state legislators very much or that many governors. One last point is I think we're in a fundamentally different place in American politics than we were, say, 10 years ago, where we've seen growing polarization and a greater pattern of uniform partisan control, either pure Democratic or pure Republican in a number of states, and I think that's going to continue after the coming election. That creates a very different climate from where we were in 2003, 4, and 5, where you actually had some very creative bipartisan coalitions begin to emerge. Again, change of characters and perhaps a change of politics only ups the bar for some of the very points that you're talking about.
Good morning. My name is Rebecca Rear, and I'm with the Maryland Environmental Health Network. And I think we heard pretty clearly this morning that public health, that energy choices are public health choices. But I look around the room and I'm wondering how many people in here consider themselves public health professionals? Yeah. So yeah, me too. Okay, so we have two of us. And so how do we solidify that message and that conversation that energy choices influence public health and that good and healthy energy choices can create a healthy human population, not just for children or future generations, which seems to be this other far-off concept, but how many people in here were once a child? Right? So if we're protecting children, we're protecting ourselves, right? And I worry sometimes that environmentalists use the public health messaging superficially when it suits their messaging, whereas I feel that public health is at the core of our energy choices and many of our environmental choices. And I'd invite the panel to respond.
So we see that in our data. As you know, Rebecca, we've been doing surveys in Maryland. It's wherever we've looked, the same truth emerges, which is that health is what is principally driving people's preferences. It's one of our greatest, deepest values. The message that I don't believe is being delivered very clearly is, how much this will benefit our health as we make this transition to clean, renewable energies. So your challenge is exactly right, and it's one that is very. We've tested it, and it's really quite remarkable because even Americans who don't believe that the climate is changing still believe that there are tangible health benefits from cleaning up our fuel supply. So there are many reasons to care, many reasons to want to clean up our fuel supply, and health happens to be the one that translates best across the entire political spectrum.
I would direct you to the work that Mike Greenstone's been doing, because that's his entire focus, was to shift away from any kind of monetized value for carbon. He was working inside the administration for the first 2 years and just had this insight that the real benefit here, if you did a cost-benefit analysis and tried to persuade a regulatory agency or get a regulation through OIRA that was at all meaningful, it had to be something other than the monetized benefit of avoiding future greenhouse gas problems. And it was all about the public health benefits associated with getting away from some of these old, really dirty coal plants. Mike's other proposal idea, which I thought was fascinating, was that the federal government should just buy the 100 oldest coal plants and tear them down, because it would have that public health benefit. So for him, and for that string of economic research that's very targeted at the policymakers at the elite level, it's all about public health.
Hi, my name is Megan Tarr, and I am a student at Trinity Washington University here in DC. I'm conducting a little bit of research and doing a case analysis on hydraulic fracturing, and I just wanted to know what the panel thought of fracking in terms of the path to climate change, or what policy might arise as more research is conducted and as more studies are conducted.
Club is working hard to leapfrog over natural gas to the extent that we have can drive those kind of decisions, because we are a grassroots organization. We're the nation's largest grassroots environmental organization. We have members who are seeing fracking pop up in their backyards. They're very worried about the local health effects and the effects on their property values, and so that's why we are pushing so hard on wind and solar and energy efficiency, because we think that's, there's just a huge amount more market opportunity for those things to grow. As we see, the public opinion is just wildly in favor of it. And so with the resources that we have at the Sierra Club, we are pushing very hard to scale up wind and solar and energy efficiency as fast as we can, to leapfrog over gas as fast as we can. But it's definitely a big driver of what we see happening in the energy sector today. Nobody can deny that.
If I could just maybe add a couple of points to that. So yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, we're seeing gas as sort of this bridging fuel in our industry to move from where we were going through this transformation and transition I talked about to a cleaner, lower emitting power sector. And I mean, gas is about half, a little bit more than half of the CO2 of coal. So just being able to make that replacement, and we're seeing a lot of that in our industry. I think Mary Ann cited some of the statistics of the coal plants that have closed down. You look at EPA's own carbon power plan, and it projects further retirements of coal, and a big piece of that is sort of using less coal and using more gas, you know, kind of in this road to the future. And so it's an important fuel source for us, and of course it's driving a lot of this transition because fracking is making available a lot of supply. There are a whole host of issues now being raised with that. I think EPA has signaled they're going to be taking a deeper look at fracking and what's going on with that and what kind of regulations might we need to make sure that that's going on in a fashion that isn't unduly harming, because of course the potential emissions, right, methane escaping far more potent than carbon. So, you know, while the fuel source might look good and generating electricity might look like a big benefit, you might find out that by the time you factor in the escaping methane, maybe that equation's a little bit different. I've seen studies that would say it's a whole lot different. I mean, there's studies always, of course, on every side of the issue, but so that's an issue that needs to be taken into account. For us, it's sort of, you know, we're using the fuel source right now as a transition, but, you know, trying to move to that, to another kind of future down the road.
I do think one of the really interesting stories that comes to me through this book, although I won't do a dramatic reading this time, is the natural gas story. Yeah. It's not in the coal category. It's not in the wind and solar category. Now, that said, I don't know how the response would change as you begin to ask natural gas in conjunction with hydraulic fracturing or fracking or something along those lines and begin to put those packages together. But it does occupy a unique part of this story. It has not been a trivial part of the American story of emission reduction in terms of substituting some natural gas from fracking for that coal. And it's a discussion that's beginning to emerge in our continental partners, but other places around the world as well. And as we've begun, Chris Borick and I, to do some state-to-state surveys on this, we find wild differences depending upon the jurisdiction, far more so than you would see state-to-state on climate kinds of questions. General support for benefits and risks on fracking. Put that across the Pennsylvania and New York border, you're in pretty different worlds, even though you're basically sharing one common resource. So sorting some of those issues out are going to be challenging, and yet natural gas does prevent potentially some bridging opportunities, but also some obviously big, big, big risks.
I think one of the subtle issues here is a property right issue, and how the property rights were dealt with in different states had huge effects on public acceptance of fracking and the campaign against it. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in Texas, because there's this very unusual case called the Day case that changed property rights. I guess it was last year. Changed your mineral rights, said your mineral rights go all the way down from your property. It used to be you only had mineral rights at the surface. And it'll be interesting what kind of fight that has. But Texans have been generally supportive of fracking, but their attitudes might change if they understand that they may have a claim to those gas supplies.
Thank you.
My name is Mike DeLiso, University of Pennsylvania School of Engineering, and currently doing work in the natural gas markets. My question is related to electric reliability that can actually be provided in a carbon-free and carbon-neutral manner. You know, the last question on natural gas definitely is sort of a lead-in to this. What is the strategy going forward for carbon-free and carbon-neutral electrical energy that you know, operates at nighttime when we're in drought in California and when the wind's not blowing?
I see this as a part of the evolution of the electric sector, and I think, you know, California is obviously the farthest ahead. They've got a 30% RPS. They have actually put out RFPs for energy storage. They have an energy storage mandate now in the state where they're going to be developing some energy storage. So that's clearly, you know, between hydro, you know, wind blowing at night, solar during the day, and storage, there is ultimately a world, I think, where we could have a carbon-free grid, but it's not something that we can do overnight. And I think that region by region, as the economics of clean energy change, and as storage, we finally try to get that to some kind of scale, there's a saying that I like, that we make the road by walking, and I think this is a situation where we have some very pioneering efforts in California, Oregon and Washington to some degree, starting up in the Northeast, that again, it's not going to happen overnight, but people are solving these problems and getting us closer and closer to that goal. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this as well.
Well, and actually very, very similar thoughts. I mean, I was going to the same place. It's really, I mean, for a carbon-free type of world, a lot of it is, I think, a lot of focus on battery storage. I mean, it's all the things, right? It's improving efficiency and getting people to be smarter with their energy use so you have less demand. But on the demand side, right, if you're going to go, the more we want to shift to renewables as a zero-emitting resource, the more we're going to need something like battery storage just because of the intermittent nature, right? They come on and come off. You've got to have, that's why there's, one reason there's so many gas plants, right? You've got to be able to ramp up quickly as the wind comes down to keep the grid in balance. And that's its own fascinating study about what goes into just keeping the grid in balance. Lots of very boring details that are incredibly important to making sure that everything flows smoothly. But yeah, so as you're going to have those kind of resources, it's balancing, right? It's being able to mix your wind and your pump storage hydro. It's being able to get this battery storage so you might be able to hang on to, maybe it's your concentrated solar or it's rooftop or it's wind, and then you can deploy it back out, as there are fluctuations in voltage. There's a lot of research going on in that. I mean, that's kind of been a bit of a holy grail in some ways for that element of energy generation for probably well over a decade. And I know a lot of our members through the Electric Power Research Institute doing a lot of work on that. Marianne, I mean, there's a couple of, Marianne cited some of the work that's going on in California with microgrid development. That's another way people are trying to tap into that kind of reality. There's a really good project going on up in New York. Central Hudson's putting in what could potentially be the first sort of large-scale microgrid. It's just, yeah, I mean, you got to walk there, right? It's not, there's like not quite a super highway yet, but we got construction crews and we're making some progress, and we got engineers thinking about how to do it better. It's just, as you know, as an engineer, right, with power, it's a huge sort of complex operation, and it just obviously takes a while to develop and refine and deploy those technologies that can take us to a lower emitting, maybe non-emitting future.
Any chance for nuclear to become part of the ramping solution?
Well, I mean, in our industry, we like all fuels. I mean, our job is to provide safe, affordable, reliable, and increasingly cleaner energy to our customers, the public. We like all fuels because that helps you balance all of your different risks, your market risks, your supply risks, all of that stuff. Certainly nuclear is 20% of the nation's power. And I guess my thought on that is, I mean, I certainly hope it plays a role because it is zero emission. I know there's a lot of controversy about it, but it's a zero emission, very safe resource. There's been a lot of progress in that industry. Could have a huge role, I think, down the road. It's a great baseload resource that could play a very critical role, but there's a lot of public acceptance issues. There's financing issues. I mean, they're expensive. So a lot of things to be dealt with there, but I think it can play an important role. And, part of me says, well, what happens in 2030 when basically that whole suite of that chunk of the power generation, 20% zero emission, kind of comes up for the next step in its lifetime? What if those all close down? Well, we'd better have perfected battery storage by then, or we're going to have a real tough time meeting any kind of carbon goal. So, yeah, slow steps, but we're getting there.
It'll probably not surprise you to know that the Sierra Club member feelings about nuclear are similar to, I think, what you found in your research, which is concerns about the health and environmental impacts and a little bit of wariness about it as a path forward.
Nuclear is the most polarized of all the fuel sources. It had the highest percentage saying don't use it at all, but there was also pretty big support base for it. So it was the most divided, the fewest keep it the same or something like that.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Claire August. I'm a student at GW's Elliott School of International Affairs and leader of our student-run environmental group called Green GW. I wanted to bring the conversation back to Mr. Maybach's comment about the disconnect between public interest and our elected officials' actions. And to me, that disconnect stood out to me very strongly as monetary interest in politics. While public interest might speak loudly to our elected officials, I feel like monetary donations and monetary interest from public special interest groups and corporations can certainly speak louder. So from the panel, I'd like to hear what your opinion is on the influence of money in politics regarding energy, and what can be done to combat it.
Well, there was an article in the New York Times, I think the day before yesterday, about how there is an unprecedented wave of environmental issues in this year's political ads. It's the third most cited issue after, I think, healthcare and the economy. And this is unprecedented. So I think that we are seeing on both sides, the fossil fuel interests trying to polarize things, but also people very concerned about climate change trying to put that forward as an issue of concern to voters. And a lot of candidates, Michigan Senate race comes to mind, who are really riding on their environmental record with, defending the Great Lakes is one of the things that they're most proud of. So I think that money in politics is not my area of expertise, but I do feel like the environment and energy issues in particular are playing a much bigger political role than we have seen ever before. And you don't have to just take my word for it. You can trust the people at the New York Times who looked at every political ad that's been running this election season. So we're in some very changing times on these issues.
So if I could add to that, I don't know what the influence of money is on political decisions. That's above my pay grade, as they say. But what I do know is how the public's perception of that question, because we asked that a number of times, including our most recent survey, and the public feels like big donors are the most influential. Industry is the second most influential. It goes way down until you get to the very bottom, which is people who share my views. So despite the fact that we live in the oldest democracy on the planet, and I believe we still live in a vibrant, wonderful democracy, there seems to be a real disconnect between citizens' views of how they would like to see our democracy evolve and what they're personally doing and who they feel has the most influence. From a psychological perspective, people who don't feel a sense of efficacy, a sense of having a say, tend not to participate. So there's a real problem there.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for the conversation. My name is Ryan Martell. I work for Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii, and I'm a McCourt School alum before it was called the McCourt School. So appreciate this. I guess this follows on to the previous question, and perhaps is maybe a little too soon, but I'm curious to know your thoughts on some messaging around climate change on public opinion, most specifically the sort of "I'm not a climate scientist" or "I'm not a scientist" meme that's been going around for the last several months. If there is any sort of data or just general thoughts or insights into how that's, what the goal of that is, specifically what the goal of that is, and also what the effect of that has been on public opinion or maybe specific campaigns in certain states. Thanks.
Yeah, have you guys been looking at that?
We have, very directly. The Republicans in America are fairly equally divided into two views on climate and change, and to a lesser degree on energy. And taking a climate denial position is quickly becoming a political liability for Republican incumbents and Republican candidates. I think that explains why we've seen that pivot towards the line, "I'm not a climate scientist." Whether or not that turns out to be an adequate pivot towards sort of neutral ground, or whether that's just a sort of a forerunner of movement towards, frankly, the opinion of the electorate on this issue, remains to be seen.
We're at our last question, which goes over here, sorry. But we'll be around so you can ask later.
Hi, my name is Eric Plunkett. I'm a graduate student at Yale's Business and Environment program, and I'm actually a former research assistant at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. You've talked a lot about how support for clean energy and environmental policy is a mile wide but an inch deep. And it seems to me that there's a huge disconnect, not just between our opinions and our elected officials, but our opinions and our own actions. So I was wondering if you could talk about how much you see this as personal and cultural, and then how much of this is a policy question of providing people with the right infrastructure and incentives in the market to make the correct choices.
Actually, I want to direct this question first to Eric, because you've been dealing with consumers, and that, I think, is where the rubber hits the road in some important ways that we haven't been talking as much about, like consumption sides of things, more about the production side. But
yeah, no, I think it's really kind of a mixture of both. I mean, you've got to have the policy discussion ultimately to kind of drive, for an issue like this, it's going to require new technologies. You're going to have to kind of push some of that. It doesn't necessarily happen on its own. But you need to reach down and engage the individual, the customer. And our industry tries to do that through, like I said, through these, the flyers in your mailings, trying to If people can invest a little bit in renewable energy, that can go a long way to help promoting those things. Getting involved in, managing your energy use, just trying to drill down to that level and make that kind of personal connection. I think you need to do that. At the same time, you're kind of trying to move the larger policy issue to set the right kind of framework, if you will, to help motivate a lot of that action, right? There's a lot of little actions that need to occur, and I think you also need to have that kind of broader framework pushing all of that and finding a way to then have that lead to something substantial.
Barry, did you want to chime in? Ed? We'll give Mary Ann the last word.
Briefly, if I could add, a recent study showed that one of the reasons people are kind of overwhelmed by climate change is the solutions that they're given, and this was written up in the New Yorker and elsewhere, are either much too small, like change your light bulb, or much too big, like we need a different Congress. And there isn't something in the middle that feels like it is a meaningful action that's going to match the scale of the problem, which is why I think our coal retirement work has been really successful, because people feel like they're really doing something at the scale of the problem that's meaningful. And I think that's at least a piece of what we need to do.
Ed?
Last word, I guess I get. The public, highly paid professionals are good at managing risks, making decisions about how to manage risks sort of logically and in a way that maximizes return on investment. The rest of us, we're not so good at that. Risk information tends to overwhelm us very quickly. Conversely, benefit information, reasons for taking action that give us more of what we want out of our life, out of our community, that turns out to be really tangible and very motivating. And once we actually motivate people, the next challenge becomes identifying the barriers that hold them back from taking action so that they can take advantage of the benefits. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road with regard to the question you laid. That the difference between people's attitudes and their actions is often we haven't done a very good job of identifying those barriers that are impeding their progress and doing anything we can to reduce those barriers or at least minimize them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so you really get the last word.
I did. That was not a setup, sorry. And here I want to do a shout out to something that as a Yale alum you'll appreciate that Ed and his team are working on, and that is how we even begin to communicate climate and related weather risks to the public by working with meteorologists, right, the front line. As we've done our work looking at climate denial issues, overwhelmingly the biggest driver when you ask people why they don't believe there's solid evidence or whatever the question is relatively recent experience or observation of weather. It frames in different ways in different parts of the country, but that's people's reference. We don't think people read IPCC studies and peer-reviewed science. What? And where do they, I know, it's tough to take. Where do they get that information? Probably from meteorologists, local weather interpretations, and all the like. All sides play this game in terms of pointing at recent evidence and trying to make their case. But thinking about how that gets rolled out and communicated, particularly in the microclimate of a state, or closely and thinking about this in some very creative ways. So that could be part of this going forward.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, each of you, for a great discussion. Any announcements?